My name is Paige Ingram, and I was 34 the morning my mother texted me before the sun came up. No hello, no how's the business? Just to demand the way you'd talk to a bank. I had paid the mortgage on my parents' house 96 times. In there, well, my name showed up exactly 0. I found that will by accident in a folder. I'd been asked to organize, and I read it. Once, then twice, then sat in my car for an hour. And what I did after that, none of them saw coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we sit with the quiet women who finally stopped explaining themselves and let the truth do the talking. If stories about boundaries, dignity, and slow justice are your kind of evening, your home, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and subscribe so the next one finds you. That morning's text wasn't the first. For 8 years, my phone had a particular rhythm to it. A call from my parents' house meant a number was coming. A utility bill, a roof repair, a COI, the property tax. I run a small bookkeeping business out of a rented office in Marysville, 40 minutes from where I grew up. I built it from one client to 40 over a decade. I am the person who reconciles other people's accounts to the penny and sleeps fine. I was raised to be useful, and I was good at it. And somewhere along the way, useful turned into expected. My parents' house sits on 3 acres outside of town, small enough that everyone knows whose truck is in whose driveway. I had my own place by then, a 2-bedroom condo I paid for myself, 50 minutes away, far enough to breathe, close enough to come running, and I always came running. My younger brother, Eric, lived an hour the other direction and somehow distance never reached his phone the way it reached mine. When the water heater died, they called me. When Eric's car needed brakes, they called me. I told myself this was what daughters did. I told myself a lot of things in those 8 years. The truth is, I never once asked what they'd written down about me when no one was watching. I should have, because the morning my mother sent that text, I already half knew the answer, and I still wasn't ready for how much it would cost me to finally act on it. To explain that text, I have to go back 8 years to the winter the house almost went under. My father, Raymond, had retired early after his back gave out at the plant. My mother, Carol, had never worked outside the home. They'd refinanced twice during the good years and pulled cash out both times, the way a lot of people did. Then the payments ballooned and the savings didn't. I was 26. I got the call on a Tuesday. The bank had sent a letter with the word for closure in it, and my mother read it to me over the phone like a recipe she didn't understand. I drove out that night. We sat at the kitchen table with the letter between us. The only way to save the house was to refinance again, and the bank would not lend to two retirees with no income and a credit score in the basement. They needed someone with a steady business and clean credit. They needed me, so I signed. But the closing attorney wouldn't let me put my savings and my credit on the line for nothing, the way he said too many adult children do. He structured it the way these deals have to be structured if they're going to protect the person taking the risk. My parents signed a fresh deed that afternoon, granting me the larger share of the house in exchange for the cash I brought to clear the R's and the loan I was taking on in my own name. I walked out the primary borrower and the majority owner of record on the same day, the percentages written in plain numbers right there on the deed. My father called it just paperwork. My mother called it a blessing. I called it keeping a roof over my parents. I kept the closing folder in a fireproof box because I keep folders. That's the kind of woman I am. It would matter more than any of us understood at that table. After that night, the payment was mine. Every month, the first of the month on auto pay from my business account, $1,140. Like clockwork for 8 years. I added the property tax when it came due. I covered the new furnace in year 3 and the roof in year 6. None of it was a secret. I wasn't sneaking money into envelopes. I'd hand my mother the receipts and she'd pat my hand and call me a good girl. Meanwhile, my brother, Eric, was the subject of every dinner. Eric was sensitive. Eric was finding himself. Eric had quit his 4th job that year, and my father said the boy just hadn't met the right opportunity. When Eric needed help with rent, my parents asked me and I sent it, and somehow that became a loan I'd made my parents instead of a gift I'd made him. I noticed the pattern. I'm an accountant. Noticing patterns is the whole job. I'd raise it gently at the holidays. Maybe Eric could chip in. Maybe we could split things. My mother would get a wounded look and change the subject to the casserole. My father would say, families don't nickel and dime each other. I let it go every time because the alternative was a fight, and because the loan had my name on it, and walking away met my credit and their home. So I stayed the reliable one. I told myself reliable was a compliment. It took me 8 years to learn. It was a job description, and that I was The only one who'd never been told the salary. The spring, my father had his heart attack. Everything tightened. It happened on a Sunday in the garden with a tomato cage in his hands. My mother called me before she called the ambulance, which tells you something about the order of things in that house. I drove the 50 minutes and 38. He pulled through a stent. 4 days in the hospital. A stack of discharge papers nobody in that house would ever read. So I read them. I always read them. I set up his medications in a weekly organizer. I called the cardiologist's office and learned the difference between a beta blocker and a blood thinner. And because a brush with death makes people want their affairs in order, my parents decided it was time to do their will properly with a real lawyer in town instead of a form off the internet. My mother handed me a grocery bag full of documents and asked me to sort and file them because I was the one who was good at that. I sat at my kitchen table that night with a glass of wine and her grocery bag, bank statements, insurance, cards, the deed I already knew by heart. And at the bottom, in a fresh manila envelope with the lawyer's return address, a document I had never been shown. The flap wasn't even sealed. I told myself not to read it. Then I read it anyway because I am the kind of woman who reads what's in front of her, and I had never once been sorry about that. Until that night. It was their last will and testament, signed and witnessed barely 2 weeks. After my father came home from the hospital, I read it the way I read a balance sheet line by line looking for my own name. It wasn't there. The house, the 3 acres, the truck, the savings account I'd helped rebuild, my mother's jewelry, every last thing they owned to be inherited in full by their son, Eric Ingram. There was one sentence about me. It said their daughter had been provided for during their lifetime and therefore would not share in the estate provided for. I'd made 96 mortgage payments and they'd made one sentence. And the sentence was about how I'd already gotten enough. I read it again to be sure I hadn't misread. Accountants, double check. I hadn't misread. The will had been drawn up while I was setting up his pill organizer and arguing with his pharmacy over a prior authorization.
Yeah.
Same month, I'd covered a $4,000 special assessment so the house wouldn't get a lien. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the daughter to cry, and I didn't. He sat very still and felt something reorganize itself inside me, quiet and final. The way a column of numbers reorganizes when you finally find the area you've been hunting for an hour. I put the will back in its envelope. I filed it neatly, the way I'd been asked, and I poured the rest of the wine down the sink because I wanted to remember this with a clear head. I went to Sunday dinner the next week and said nothing about the will. I wanted to understand it first the way you want to understand a number before you act on it. My mother made pot roast. Eric was there and his girlfriend, Brittany, who'd recently become a fiancé, and then very quickly something more. The talk turned, as it always did, to the future of the house. Eric said he and Brittany were thinking of moving in to help out now that Dad's health was a concern. My mother lit up. My father carving the roast said it made sense to keep the place in the family for the next generation. I asked as evenly as I could what he meant by family. He didn't even look up from the meat. He said, the home goes to the son. That's how it's always been done. He said it the way you'd state the weather. My mother nodded along and reached for the gravy. Eric smiled at his plate like a man who'd just been handed a deed. Nobody in that kitchen knew I'd read the will. Nobody thought they had to explain it to me because in their version of the story, I was the bank. And you don't explain the will to the bank. I passed the potatoes. I asked about my father's next cardiology appointment. I drove the 50 minutes back to my own house with both hands on the wheel and that one sentence on a loop. The whole way, the home goes to the son. I had paid for that home for 8 years, and apparently I had been paying to give it away. That night I sat in my own living room, in a house I'd paid for with my own name, and I made a decision the way I make every important decision, with a spreadsheet open. I listed 8 years of payments, the mortgage, the taxes, the furnace, the roof, the assessment, Eric's rent that had quietly become mine. The total had 6 figures in it. Then I listed what I'd been promised in return, and that column was empty because there had never been a promise, only an assumption, and I was the one who'd made it. I'm not a dramatic person. I wasn't going to make a speech or send a letter or stand in the kitchen and tell my parents how they'd hurt me. They'd only hear ingratitude, and I'd only sound like the bank refusing a loan. So I did the one thing a quiet woman with clean credit can do that. Lands harder than any speech. I opened my banking app. I found the auto pay I'd set up 8 years earlier, the one that ran like clockwork on the first of every month, and I turned it off. No Announcement, no warning, just silence. Where a payment used to be, I learned that night that silence is very loud in. A house that runs on someone else's money, it would take them exactly one billing cycle to hear it, and it would take everything I had not to turn that payment back on out of habit. The first few days were strange. My thumb hovered over that app more than once. 8 years of habit doesn't switch off as cleanly as the autopipe did, but I left it off. I went to work. I reconciled my clients' books and ate lunch at my desk and called my father to check on his blood pressure the way I always did and said nothing about money. The mortgage was due on the 1st. The 1st came and went. On the 4th, the lender's app sent me a notice addressed to me because the loan was mine that the payment was past due. I read it twice and set the phone face down. There is a particular discipline to doing nothing on purpose, and I had spent my whole life practicing the opposite. My instinct screamed to fix it. Fixing things was who I was. I made a cup of coffee instead and let the notice sit. I told myself a true thing over and over until it stopped shaking in my hands. This was not an emergency I had created. It was a bill that had finally been sent to the right person by the 8th. When the second notice came, I still hadn't heard a word from my parents. Either they had noticed or they were waiting for me to notice for them. I knew which one it was. I'd been the one who noticed. For that family for 34 years, the quiet on their end was a peace. It was a fuse, and somewhere out at that house, it had just been lit. My mother called on the 11th. No, hello, the way it would go a month later by text. She said the bank had phoned the house about a late payment, and there must be some mistake with my account. I said there was no mistake. I said I'd stop the autopay. The pause on the line was the longest I'd ever heard from her. Then the tears came right on schedule, the way they always did when a conversation started going somewhere she didn't like. She said she didn't understand. She said we were a family and family takes care of family. She said I'd always been her dependable one, and she didn't know what had gotten into me. I asked her gently whether dads will take care of family too. Another pause. She recovered fast. She said the will was dad's business and had nothing to do with the mortgage, and besides, you didn't keep score with your own parents. She said it like a closing argument. Family doesn't keep a ledger. I almost laughed because keeping ledgers is literally how I feed myself, and because for 8 years I'd been the only one in that family who hadn't kept one. I just paid. I didn't argue. Arguing was her sport, not mine. I told her I loved her and that we'd talk soon, and I hung up before the conversation could turn into the thing she was good at, and I wasn't. She called back twice that night. I let it go to voicemail. Then I wrote down the date because some habits are worth keeping. Eric got involved on day 12, which was fast for him. He texted first, then called when I didn't jump. His voice had the lazy confidence of a man who'd never once worried about a number. He said, Mom was a wreck, and what was my problem? And did I know how stressful this was for Dad's heart? I noticed he led with Dad's heart the way you'd lead with your strongest card. I said I was well aware of Dad's heart, having read every discharge paper and filled every prescription. He let that go. Then he told me something he clearly believed made him the bigger person. He said he understood I'd been sending money, but money wasn't everything. He said he was the one who actually showed up, who called Mom, who sat with Dad, who gave them his time while I just transferred funds from a safe distance. He said it like it settled the matter. I sat with that for a second. I thought about who'd driven 50 minutes in 38 when Dad collapsed in the garden. I thought about who set up the pill organizer and who learned what a beta blocker was. But I didn't say any of it because Eric had already decided the story. And you can't reconcile an account with someone who refuses to open the book. I just asked him one question. I asked if money wasn't everything, whether he'd like to start covering the mortgage on the house he was about to inherit. The line went quiet. Then he laughed like I'd made a joke and said, we talk, when I stopped being so dramatic. I hadn't raised my voice once. Brittany came at it from a different angle, which is how I learned she was the practical one. Months earlier, before any of this started, she'd added me as a collaborator on a shared board in one of those renovation apps, the kind where you pin photos of kitchens you can't afford yet. Evie assumed at the time it was a friendly gesture, maybe a soft hint that I'd be the one helping pay for whatever she dreamed up. She never took me off it, so the app still pinged my phone every time she added something. Her board was titled The Farmhouse. I clicked it before I could stop myself. 41 photos, white cabinets, a farmhouse sink, a wall knocked out between the kitchen and the dean. It was my parents' den. She'd already started measuring rooms that sat inside a deed with my name on it. That was the moment the abstract became concrete for me. The way a budget becomes real the first time a check bounces. They weren't just planning to inherit the house someday. They were planning to remodel it now on the assumption that the payments would keep arriving for me invisibly the way water arrives when you turn the tap. Let me pause here for a second because I think some of you already know exactly where I was sitting that night. If you've ever been the one everyone counts on, but never the one anyone counts in, the one who keeps the lights on and gets left off the guest list, you know the particular cold that settled into my chest looking at that folder. Stay with me, subscribe, so we finish this together, because I promise you the table is about to turn and I want you in the room when it does. I closed the app. I didn't leave the board. I wanted to see what the farmhouse did next. By the third week, my mother had taken the story public the way small towns do. It started with phone calls. My aunt, Lorraine, called to tell me I was breaking my mother's heart. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years texted to say she'd heard I'd cut my sick father off. And how could I didn't know what version they'd been told until my mother posted it herself in the town's community group, the one with 4,000 members where people sell hay and report lost dogs. She wrote a soft, devastating little paragraph about getting older, about how you raise your children and pray they'll be there, and how the hardest thing about aging is learning which ones really love you. She didn't use my name. She didn't have to. The comments filled with prayer hands and offers of casseroles, and one woman who wrote that kids these days have no loyalty. My phone buzzed all afternoon with people checking on my poor parents. Not one of them checked on me. I read every comment, calm as I held breath, and I understood the shape of what she'd done. She'd turned a bookkeeping decision into a morality play and cast me as the cold daughter who abandoned her family over money. It was good work. I'll give her that. My cousin Dana was the only one who called to ask my side. She listened to all of it. The 8 years. The will, the board named the farmhouse. Then she said something I wrote down. She said, "You're not the villain here. You just stopped paying for a part you were already playing." The thing that changed everything wasn't the Facebook post. It was a mistake. On a Thursday night, somebody added me to a group text by accident, probably Brittany, fumbling contacts while she set up a thread to coordinate the campaign against me. The thread was called Mom and Dad House. It had 4 people in it. My mother, my father, Eric, and Brittany. And then for about 90 seconds before anyone noticed me, I scrolled up 40 messages. I read them the way you read a confession. Brittany had written that the contractor could start in spring if the financing held. My mother had written that I'd come around, that I always came around, that I just needed to feel guilty enough. Eric had written a laughing emoji and the words "she'll fold by Christmas. She can't help herself." And my father, who'd had a stent put in his chest while I learned his medications, had written the line that finished something in me. He wrote, "Once the house is Eric's, this stops being her problem anyway." They had a word for me in that thread, and it wasn't daughter. It was a noun you'd find on a bank statement. I took a screenshot of all of it, every message, because I keep records and because a woman who's about to be called needs receipts. Then somebody noticed the extra name. The typing dots appeared and vanished. Eric removed me from the group without a word, but I had it. I had it in my own hand. And for the first time in 8 years, I stopped feeling like the problem and started feeling like the person holding the answer. That screenshot sent me to the fireproof box. I hadn't opened it in years because I didn't need to. I knew what I'd signed, but knowing a thing and looking at it are different. And that night I needed to look. I pulled the closing folder, the one I'd kept since I was 26, and spread it across my kitchen table. Under the good light, the note from the lender, the settlement statement, and the deed. I read it slowly the way I'd read the will, except this time I was looking for my name, and it was right there at the top. Not as a guarantor, not as a cosigner doing my parents a favor, as an owner. The refinance 8 years ago hadn't just put my name on the loan. It had put me on the title as a tenant in common, and because I'd brought the cash that saved the house, I held the larger share. The document spelled out the percentages in plain numbers. I sat back in my chair. My father's will left everything to Eric, but a will can only give away what you actually own, and the house my father had just promised to his son, the house Brittany was measuring for a farmhouse. Sink was on paper mostly mine, had been. For 8 years, they'd been planning to gift my brother a home that I legally co-owned, and they'd rid me out of an estate that, where the house was concerned, was never fully theirs to. Right. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something colder and steadier. I felt like an accountant who'd finally found the error. Now I just had to decide what to do with it. I didn't trust myself to read a legal document and act on it alone. People make that mistake and lose everything. So I called a woman I'd kept Books for a real estate attorney named Gwen Howerin, who ran a two-person firm. Above the hardware store, I brought her the deed, the settlement statement, and 8 years of mortgage records. She read them with her glasses pushed up on her head and made a small sound, the kind professionals make when the facts are cleaner than they expected. She told me carefully that she'd want to confirm the exact percentages and pull the recorded title, but as the documents read, I was the majority owner of record and the primary borrower. She told me a will only passes what a person owns at death. So my father could leave Eric his share, but not mine. Then she told me the part that mattered most, the part I'd have suspected and needed a professional to say out loud. My parents could not sell the house, refinance it, or remodel it in any way that touched the structure without my written consent, because you cannot do those things to a property without every owner signing. I asked her what my options were. She listed them like a menu. No drama, just law. I could force a sale and take my share. I could buy out their portion at fair value, or I could simply keep being the owner I'd always been and let the people in the farmhouse board discover the house wasn't theirs to give. I thanked her and paid her invoice that same day because I'm not a hypocrite about bills. Then I went home to wait. It was a month almost to the day after I turned off the autopay. For weeks of voicemails, castles for my parents, prayer hands in the town group, and a contractor holding a spring start date. For weeks of me saying nothing and owning everything. Then at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning, before I'd even started the coffee, my mother sent the textile. Remember for the rest of my life. No. Hello, no, how's the business? No, how are you, sweetheart, after all these years? Just a flat little demand. And a punctuation mark sharp as a slammed door. The mortgage is due. I stood at my own kitchen counter in my own paid-for house and looked at that text for a long time. I thought about 96 payments. I thought about the will and the one sentence that said I'd been provided for. I thought about the thread where I'd become a noun on a bank statement, and my father had written that soon I'd stop being his problem. And then I did the thing this whole story is built around. I simply replied, I didn't write a paragraph. I didn't list the 8 years. I didn't mention the deed because I was saving that for a room with witnesses in it. I wrote one calm line and pressed send. Everything goes to Eric. So does the mortgage. Then I turned my phone face down, poured my coffee, and drank it while it was still hot, which I hadn't managed to do in years. I had never sent anything that quiet, that landed that hard. My phone, face down on the counter, started to buzz before I finished the coffee. I let it. When I finally turned it over, there were 9 missed calls and a wall of text. My mother, all caps, in places, asking how I could be so cool. Eric, telling me I'd given Dad chest pains and he hoped I was happy. Brittany, who I never once had a real conversation with, informing me that I was tearing this family apart over a grudge. The word grudge did a lot of work that morning. They'd taken a sentence about a will and turned it back into the story they liked best, the one where I was cold and they were wronged. My Aunt Lorraine left a voicemail saying she'd never been so disappointed in a niece. The town group lit up again. My mother had apparently posted that her own health was failing under the stress, which was a new and creative addition. I read all of it, calm as a balanced ledger. Here is the thing they never understood about me. I wasn't doing this in a rage. Rage burns out, and they were counting on mine to burn out the way it always had, leaving me apologetic and back on autopay by Christmas. But I wasn't angry anymore. I'd moved past angry into something they had no defense against. I was certain, and a certain woman with a deed in her fireproof box is a great deal more dangerous than an angry one. I texted my mother back one more time that day. I wrote that we should all sit down together. Then I called Gwen and told her I was ready. My father called me himself that evening, which he almost never did. His voice was rougher than I remembered, and I could hear the television going in the background, the volume too high the way it gets when someone's hard of hearing and proud about it. He didn't yell. That wasn't his way. He started by asking about my business, which startled me because he hadn't asked in years. Then he got to it. He said he didn't understand why I was doing this to them. He said, a man works his whole life and all he wants is to leave something behind to know his name carries on. He said it the way he believed it. And for one strange moment, I felt the pull of it, the old farm logic. The father who'd watched his own father hand the land to a son and assumed that was simply how the world was built. I let myself feel it. Then he said the line again, the one from the kitchen, except quieter and somehow worse. He said, the home goes to the son. That's how it's always been done. And the feeling passed because I Realized he wasn't asking me to understand him. He was asking me to keep paying for a tradition that erased me and to be grateful for the privilege. I told him I loved him. I meant it. I told him I'd be at the house Sunday and that we should all sit down together. Him, Mom, Eric, Brittany, and talk like adults. He said, good. Finally, some sense. He thought he'd won. He thought I was coming to apologize. I let him think. Some conversations are better had at a table in front of everyone with the folder closed until the right moment. The dinner got organized with a speed my family never managed for anything that didn't involve cornering me. My mother set it for Sunday at 5. By Saturday, I learned through Dana that it wasn't going to be just the 5 of us. My mother had invited my Aunt Lorraine and her husband, 2 cousins, and a neighbor, couple who'd been friends of the family for 30 years, witnesses though she'd have called them support. The plan was obvious once Dana described it. They were going to sit me down in a full room and apply the only pressure my family had ever found that worked on me, an audience. They'd learned long ago that I would do almost anything to avoid making a scene in front of people. A quiet woman hates a public scene the way a cat hates water. They were betting on it. They figured that surrounded by relatives with my mother dabbing her eyes and my father's bad heart in the room, I'd cave, apologize, and turn the autopay back on just to make the discomfort stop. It was a good plan. It was the plan that had always worked. They prepared for every version of me, except the real one, and I'll let myself enjoy this one. I wanted an audience. 2, I wanted witnesses. I'd just been planning to bring different evidence to the same room. Dana asked if I was okay. I told her to come Sunday and sit near the back. I told her to bring her phone charged. She asked why. I said because she'd want to remember this one accurately, and the town group was going to need a correction. I spent Saturday night the way I'd spent the night. I found the will at my kitchen table under the good light, getting my numbers in order. But this time I wasn't grieving. I was preparing. I made 3 copies of everything. The deed with my name and my majority share highlighted in yellow. The settlement statement from the refinance. 8 years of mortgage. Payment records printed in a neat column with a total at the bottom that made even me blink. Gwen's letter on her firm's letterhead confirming in careful lawyer-proof language that I was the majority owner of record and that the property could not be sold, refinanced, or structurally altered without my consent. I slid each set into a plain manila folder, the same kind I'd filed the will in. I want to say something to you here the way I'd want a friend to say it to me. If you're still listening, thank you, because I know this part is hard, being painted as the cold one when you're the only person who ever kept the lights on. Hit subscribe and stay for dinner. I promise you the table turns, and you've earned the right to be there when it does. I didn't prepare a speech. People who bring speeches to fights like this always lose because a speech can be interrupted and a document cannot. I just packed the folders into my bag, set out my clothes, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in a month. The reliable daughter was done being reliable about the wrong things. Sunday morning, before I left, the farmhouse board did the next thing I'd been waiting for. Brittany, who'd long since forgotten she'd ever added me to that board, added a new item, a contractor's estimate, screenshotted and pinned to the top. $43,000. Demo the den wall, new kitchen, farmhouse sink, the works. There was a handwritten note in the app's caption. Deposit due at signing. Eric says Mom can cover it from savings. From savings? The savings account I'd spent 8 years helping rebuild, the one named in the will as Eric's inheritance. They were going to spend my parents' money I'd backfilled for years to renovate a house I owned as a gift to my brother, while telling the whole town I was the one bleeding the family dry. I screenshotted the estimate and added it to my folder. I wasn't angry exactly. I'd left angry behind weeks ago, but I felt the last bit of hesitation drain out of me, the small voice that had still been whispering, maybe you're overreacting, maybe just turn the payment back on. That voice went quiet for good at $43,000. There's a kind of clarity that only arrives when someone shows you in writing exactly how little they think of you. They'd handed me mine in a renovation app with a farmhouse sink and a deposit my mother couldn't actually authorize because the den wall they wanted to knock down was a load-bearing wall in a house that could not be touched without my signature. They just didn't know that yet. I put on my coat. It was time to drive out to the house. The drive out to my parents' house takes 50 minutes, and I know every mile of it. I drove it that Sunday with the folders on the passenger seat and the radio off. I wasn't rehearsing. I'd stopped rehearsing somewhere around the night I found the will. Instead, I thought about the woman I'd been at 26 signing those papers at the kitchen table, because the Alternative was watching my parents lose their home. I didn't regret her. She'd done the right thing with the information she had. The mistake hadn't been signing. The mistake had been spending 8 years believing that love was something you proved by paying and silence was something you bought by never asking for your share. I passed the gas station where I used to buy my father's lottery tickets. I passed the church my mother posted from. I passed the turnoff to Eric's old apartment, the one I'd covered rent on twice. The fields were brown and flat under a gray sky, the kind of plain Ohio afternoon that doesn't perform for anyone. I felt calm in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Not numb, calm, the way you feel when the numbers finally tie out. And you know the books are clean. I wasn't going to win this by being the loudest person at the table. My family had cornered the market on loud. I was going to win it by being right on paper, in front of witnesses, and by staying quiet enough that the quiet itself became the loudest thing in the room. I turned onto the gravel drive at 4:58. There were 6 cars already there. The house smelled like pot roast again, because my mother believed pot roast could win any argument, and for 34 years she'd mostly been right. The dining room table had been pulled out too, its full length, both leaves in the good tablecloth on. My Aunt Lorraine sat with her arms crossed. The neighbor couple wore their church faces. Dana was near the back like I'd asked her phone in her lap. My father sat at the head, looking smaller than he used to, one hand resting on his chest out of new habit. My mother had a tissue already, bald lead in her fist before a single word had been said. Eric and Brittany sat together on the long side, and Brittany had the particular brightness of a woman who thinks she's about to get her farmhouse sink. They'd set the table for an apology. Every face in that room was arranged to receive one. I set my bag down by my chair, took off my coat, and folded my hands on the tablecloth. Evie brought a folder instead. My mother opened because she always opened. She didn't wait for me to sit fully. She started with the speech she'd clearly practiced, the one about ungrateful children and aging parents, her voice catching on cue at the word alone. My Aunt Lorraine murmured, "Amen," like we were in church. My father stared at the tablecloth. Then Eric took over because the two of them worked like a relay team. He stood up, actually stood for effect, and said it was time I heard how this looked from the outside. He said I'd cut off my own sick father over money. He said I was punishing my parents for a will that was none of my business. And then he delivered the line. They'd all come to watch land. He looked around the table at the witnesses, lowered his voice to something grave, and said, "So you'd really put your own parents out on the street over a grudge?" The room turned to me. This was the moment. This was where the reliable daughter folded, apologized, and reached for her phone to turn the autopay back on just to make the awful silence stop. I felt all of them lean toward it. I did not raise my voice. I didn't even unfold my hands. Right away, I let the question sit in the air long enough that everyone heard how ugly it was. Then I said very quietly that no one was putting anyone on the street. I said I'd never threatened that, not once, and asked Eric to tell the room who had actually used those words. He couldn't because it had been him. The first crack appeared in the plan, and only I could see it. Yet